Hello and welcome to the Khayrion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. My guest today is Professor László Csicsmann, and we will continue our discussions about the current political and security situation in Israel. Welcome.
Good afternoon.
My first question concerning this conflict is that we have seen the reactions of the world. We have seen the reactions of the US. We have seen the reactions of all the big powers. However, what are the reactions inside Palestine? The reaction of other Palestinian parties, groups, and maybe not so organized actors. I'm talking about the Palestinian National Authority, the Fatah, the PLO, the Islamic Jihad, or the Al-Aqsa Brigades.
As you know, the Palestinian Authority has been divided since 2007. Since then, the Gaza Strip dominated by the Hamas movement, and the West Bank is dominated by the Fatah movement. Very recently, the president of the Palestinian Authority, the leader of Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, published a kind of declaration saying that Fatah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization is the sole representative of the Palestinian people, which is, I think, a kind of politically motivated declaration against the Hamas, which is trying to represent the Palestinian people. However, it was expected that Mahmoud Abbas is going to visit on the first days of the conflict Moscow. I saw a lot of things in the news that he's expected to visit Moscow, but this has not happened. And there was an expectation today that when Biden's visiting Israel, that he's going to have a regional meeting with Arab countries, including Mahmoud Abbas. But the very recent event which happened in Gaza, the civilian deaths in the Gaza's hospital, after that, all Arab countries, I would say, refused to meet with the US president, who is at the moment in Israel. So PLO and Fatah is not in an easy situation at this moment. And in the news, the first sentence in the Palestinian media was that the Palestinian leader even condemned Hamas attack. However, just a few hours later, it was modified, not saying anything about the Hamas attack, just saying that we are the sole representative of the Palestinian people. So I think this whole issue within Palestine is all about the hearts and minds, how to attract more Palestinian citizens. And it seems the PLO and Fatah, especially Mahmoud Abbas himself, is quite weak politically at this moment. And the whole Palestinian population is quite dissatisfied with his leadership. Especially, he's quite old. He has been regarded as a corrupt politician. And there is a new generation of within the Fatah movement itself. And they have a kind of vision to replace him and to have a new leadership of Fatah.
In the past years, we may have been observing the emergence of a number of small-scale military or paramilitary groups in the Gaza Strip, mainly consisting of, we could say, angry young men who have not associated themselves with Hamas or any other existing organization. Yet they did call for armed resistance against Israel. Have these groups played any role in the outbreak of the current conflict? And do we know anything about their activities now?
Yeah, first of all, let's clarify those issues, because especially after 2007, after the takeover in the Gaza Strip by Hamas, when the political divide happened between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we see an emergence of splinter groups, I would say, from Hamas. Those young men who are dissatisfied with the pragmatist approach of Hamas, and especially these young men have the willingness to fight more against Israel, so more resistance, and they called for less political pragmatism. Especially, that time, it was the more political, the pragmatist wing of Hamas which dominated the movement, especially after the elections in 2006, led by Ismail Haniyeh. And those young men was quite dissatisfied. And we have a number of splinter groups from Hamas. Just let me name some of them. For instance, Jais al-Islam, Jund Ansar Allah, or Tawhid wal Jihad. A number of small organizations, which I would call them as Salafist jihadist organizations. They are much more closer to Al-Qaeda, or even later, the 2010s, it's getting closer to Islamic State as well. And they remained in fighting, of course, against Israel. So they have been involved in a number of terror attacks, fighting together with Hamas. And of course, these groups are still there within the Gaza Strip and, of course, still fighting for the Palestinian issue, I would say, or for the Palestinian state. They were not part of this, what happened now in the Gaza Strip. However, they are usually supportive of these events, what's going on there. Islamic Jihad is another group which we should mention. It's not competitive, but it's a different group from with the same ideology like Hamas. And this Islamic Jihad is being fighting together with Hamas as well. But we should mention us at the same time, there is an emergence of a new type of radical movements in the West Bank as well, which is much more interesting. And very recently, Israel preoccupied with those armed groups, especially last year and earlier this year, in several cities like Jenin in the Palestinian Authority or Nablus. We see an emergence of these new groups. Sometimes the members are from the Fatah, former member of Fatah, or even from Hamas, from the Gaza Strip. They joined there to start an armed resistance against Israel. And let me just name a few among them. It's like the Lion's Den in Nablus or in Jenin, the Jenin Brigades are two very important small groups, which these groups have not been controlled by the PLO or by the Palestinian Authority or by Mahmoud Abbas. It seems that in the West Bank, it's much more problematic for the president because the president could not control those groups. And especially this angry young man turned against Israel. And the recent year, we see an emergence of escalation in the West Bank. So this is one of the reasons behind Israel neglected the Gaza Strip from this perspective, because it has been much more preoccupied with this armed resistance in the West Bank. Not to mention the sole persons, the guest workers crossing the border from West Bank to Israel. We see a lot of that in that wave of escalation when Palestinian citizens from the West Bank attacking Israeli citizens, or on the other side of the coin, when Israeli settlers in the West Bank attacking now and very recently Palestinian citizens. So the wave of escalation was mainly part of the West Bank. However, a bit returning to the Gaza Strip, it would be important to mention that many of these small jihadist Salafist groups, they have been quite close to Egyptian and even other groups in the region, I mean Islamic State brand groups, which was of course very dangerous for the Egyptian security perception. So Egypt's aim, of course, is to marginalize and eliminate those groups. It's the same like Israel. This is why the situation is quite dangerous, I would say. And of course, there is a potential of escalation after eliminating Hamas, which I would say it's not possible, of course. But however, the alternatives are even more radical movements in the region, which is, of course, not an easy situation to politically solve this issue by Israel. Not to mention there is a generation in the Gaza Strip which knows only Hamas as a group or the splinter groups, and they had no experience with a normal political life because this generation grew up under this occupation by Hamas of the Gaza Strip, and they saw no alternative politically or economically, but this situation since 2007.
What can we expect from these groups now?
Well, I think definitely if there is an chaos, in that case, they could emerge and definitely they can use this vacuum for their further ideological route. They are groups, Sunni radical groups. And of course, the main aim of this group is to fight against Egyptian authorities, Israeli authorities, civilians as well. So definitely the most important task, in my opinion, in Gaza is to have stability and order there. And attacking Hamas and eliminating all the leaders, especially the military wing leaders, could endanger the whole situation because these groups can replace Hamas. Of course, they don't have the capacity to control the whole Gaza Strip. But I think any potential fighting among those groups would not have the Israeli goals neither. So I would say that at this very moment, Hamas is unfortunately the only option for Israel governing Gaza. Maybe theoretically speaking, there is another option, which is the Fatah option to have a united Palestinian authority with the merger of the Gaza Strip politically and the West Bank. However, unfortunately, I don't believe in Mahmoud Abbas' position in that. There is an urgent need to replace the Palestinian Authority leadership, which of course it could take a longer time. Elections have been expected. It was argued by Mahmoud Abbas that in 2021, and a year later, he said these elections should not be organized because of the Israeli occupation. But definitely, I think this is the most urgent issue, to have a new internal leadership of the Palestinian, which maybe can govern both sides, both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This is, of course, an option, but it takes a longer time than expected.
I would just like to add one thing. Mahmoud Abbas is almost 90 years old.
Definitely. He belongs to the older generation, but we see an emergence of younger guys as well within the Fatah movement. And even older members are quite respected politicians. Like Jibril Rajoub, for instance, is an option. He's not that young, but he's a well-respected member of the Central Committee of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So he could, for instance, replace him. Or there is Mohammed Dahlan, who is quite close to the United Arab Emirates. And it was told by many experts that because of the Abraham Accords, maybe the United Arab Emirates can solve somehow these internal issues with the Palestinian and to help to find a new leadership. And Mohammed Dahlan previously, by the way, he was the one who started to fight against the Hamas in the Gaza Strip in 2007 on behalf of Fatah movement. So it's quite interesting, in my opinion, to see that situation that he was the one in 2007 to fight against Hamas, but it was a failure, I would say. And there is Marwan Barghouti, he's generation younger politician, but he's usually most of the time is in Israeli prison, but he is quite popular among the Palestinians. So this is, I think, a huge issue to find experienced politicians who really can control both sides, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Do you think this generation that ultimately will need to step up at some point will be able to control the smaller groups, the more militant groups?
I think only in the case if there is a kind of perspective for the future. So the reasons behind the emergence of these splinter groups, even more radical groups than Hamas, is the fact that there is no perspective for the young generation who are in their 20s, in their 30s. Although, for instance, there is a university in the Gaza Strip as well. But when we are speaking about a young man with future goals, of course, living long time under a blockade by Israel and Egypt, it doesn't, I would say, it doesn't hold a nice future or perspective. So there should be a kind of political solution and future perspective for all the population, because if there is not, in that case, I think those groups will remain there. Egypt and Israel can definitely assassinate and kill most of their leaders, but we saw in the case of Afghanistan, which is of course in a different region, but most of these groups used to return after a while, even after an occupational period, like what is happened in Afghanistan. After 20 years, the Taliban returned to power in Kabul.
You kill one leadership and the next one is eventually going to emerge. Do you think these optimistic talks about giving these people some new outlook on the future is realistic at the moment?
Unfortunately not. I'm a bit skeptical about that. And not only I'm skeptical about the two-state solution, which definitely not the case, but however, 3 decades passed since the Oslo Accords, and for the Palestinians, not much happened. And especially given the fact that the Israeli society is hugely polarized now politically, but we saw recently before Hamas attack, the protest because of the judicial reform. I think after this war, this Israeli-Hamas conflict, it would remain the same. And with a polarized Israeli population and a polarized Palestinian population, it could not easy to find any political answer to this conflict in the short term. And not to mention that it was Israel's interest to maintain that type of, I would say, political and economic blockade against the Gaza Strip. Because in case of a united Palestinian Authority, the two-state solution is much more feasible. But with this political and military divide, I would say it has been serving in Israel's interest, arguing that, of course, that it's not potential to have a Palestinian state, which part of this expected state is under a terrorist group's control, which is Hamas.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to move a little bit north. Hizballah, to no surprise, expressed its support for Hamas, which, again, to no surprise, led to a series of armed skirmishes along the Israeli-Lebanese border. How do you think this issue will develop? Can we expect swift restoration of the ice-cold tension that characterizes the Israeli-Hezbollah relations? Or is there a full-blown war on the horizons?
Well, that's, I think, the most interesting question at this moment. And it is not a surprise that Hezbollah is supportive of the Hamas attack, as the movement is part of the so-called axis of resistance, which is led by Iran, which is a resistance movement against the Israeli occupation. But however, I would say that Hezbollah is not an easy position at this moment, because on the one hand, Hezbollah is a military movement which has its own ideology, which is quite close to the Iranian ideology because it's a Shia movement. Iran has supported the establishment of this movement. But on the other hand, Hezbollah is Lebanonized, which means that Hezbollah is a political party within Lebanon. And now it has 2 ministers in the Lebanese government since 2021, which is not a surprise. And given the state of the Lebanese economy and political system, which is in a permanent crisis, I think for Hezbollah, it's not an easy decision to take part in a fully blown war against Israel. Let me just compare the situation with 2006, because this is, I think, the most important time when all of us remember the Israelis' intervention against Hezbollah in Sudan, Lebanon, which is used to call as the Second Lebanese War, although it was not a war against the Lebanese government, but it was against eliminating Hezbollah's military infrastructure in the south. But what were the motivation behind Hezbollah's decision to attack Israel at that time? It was a strong government, so Hezbollah was supported by many political movements. If we compare the 2006 with 2023, Hezbollah is not as strong as it was in 2006. And the second is an economic problem. The Lebanese economy is in a permanent crisis since 2019 at least, and any Israeli attack or any war against Israel would, of course, even make the economy much worse situation, which is not the aim of Hezbollah. And external support, and I'm not speaking here only about Iran, but the Saudis and Gulf countries are quite important in Hezbollah's decision as well. We could not expect any political or financial support from the Gulf states for any Hezbollah's attack on Israel. So in my opinion, these are the reasons behind that Hezbollah would not launch a full attack on Israel. But the other question is the same as for Hamas. Hezbollah's ideology, in a way, because it's a resistance movement against Israel, of course, because of this ideology, Hezbollah should say very positive words about the Hamas attack. And rhetorically speaking, we saw rhetorics against Israel, and not only rhetorically, but we saw some rocket attacks, but these attacks at this moment quite limited. And in my opinion, these attacks would remain the same limited attacks against some military authorities in northern Israel. From the Israeli side, of course, Israel is not interested in a two-front war, because just imagine about the cost against the civilians, the soldiers, economic cost of the conflict. And Israel, I think, learned from the 2006 incident when it was not possible to eliminate the Hezbollah's infrastructure. So after 2006, Hezbollah remained a very important military and political group within Lebanon. So this war has been criticized by many Israeli politicians as well because of the goals of that war. Not all of the goals have been fulfilled at that time. So I really think that it should remain in a kind of mini conflict way between Israel and Sudan, Lebanon. And of course, it's Iran's interest to escalate the whole conflict. But I think, in my opinion, Hezbollah and Hamas are much more independent organizations rather than just to listen to what Iranians, Ayatollahs or the supreme leader saying. Definitely, Iran has an influence on these movements, but finally, in my opinion, the leader's decision is whether to attack Israel or not. So in the case of Hezbollah is, of course, Hassan Nasrallah is the most important person. In Hamas' case, it's much more difficult because the political leadership is in Qatar, and Hamas at this moment is mainly dominated by the military wing, which is dominated by Mohammed Daif, according to our knowledge.
Thank you very much. Real wonderful insights. And I can't wait for all of our next podcasts on this and many other pressing issues. Thank you very much, Professor Csicsmann.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the Khayrion podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at khayrion.com, as well as on X and LinkedIn.